Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
The number one greeting in my faith is peace.
You're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change.
You're gonna find something, not 100%, every community. Rather than tear each other down, why not build each other up?
Welcome to the third episode of the first season, The Wretched of the Earth of the Fourth Podcast. I'm Ali Wazir.
I'm Ibrahim Ali.
And I'm Talha Muhammad.
And you can help us grow by giving us a follow on Instagram at thefourth.productions and Twitter at thefourth_prod, P-R-O-D. Now back to the show. Let's continue where we left off from last week. Last week we wrapped up talking about how the best way for us to get over racism and how that really has infiltrated our mentality in regards to the colonized mindset of Muslims.
So many of the negative aspects of our lives were informed by our colonial overlords when they have previously colonized us. Ultimately, though, while recognizing their blame and initiating this by colonizing us in the first place, it's important to take responsibility for our own communities and to work and to progress from where we currently are to where we should be.
Yeah, unfortunately, the truth is that the colonization didn't end with the previously discussed political and cultural aspects of our lives. The centuries of being colonies allowed the powers to truly penetrate the most protected aspects of our life, the ones that directly affect our everyday wellness, right down to our educational systems, our spirituality, and even our families.
So Talha, as you mentioned before, man, one of the greatest aspects by which the colonizers really influenced the Southeastern and the North African communities happens to be the aspect of education. Now, Islam originally was a great movement towards learning and education when it comes to secular education and also religious education. You had the Arabs at the time essentially being illiterate and lacking morals, lacking civilization, and education was a big push from a religious perspective towards growing and learning and becoming better human beings overall through education in that system entirely.
So, Qarawiyyin is the oldest existing, continually operating higher education institute in the world, founded in 859 by Fatima al-Fihri, who's actually a woman.
Which is crazy. I mean, it's older than any currently operating university in Europe, for sure. So the thing about Islamic education, including in Al-Qarawiyyin and then all the other institutions that they founded, was that they didn't really differentiate too much between religious and secular education in the way that we perceive this difference to be today.
Yeah, I mean, so, over here in this country, we have, the separation of church and state, and that's like a huge, big deal for people. If you try to bring in like a religious aspect to, a public school environment, people get really offended. And back in the Islamic time, right, when we were in charge, before colonization, religious and secular studies were one and the same. Like, we used to do them at the same time. If you became a scientist, in any secular subject, you would also be learned a little bit in Islamic studies and Islamic sciences too.
Yeah, so if we can jump into the history of the separation of church and state, this is an idea that originated in Europe after the Renaissance. So in Europe, what had happened is that over the course of many centuries, the church and the state had merged, and each one used the other to benefit themselves. So European popes claimed to be God's representative on earth, while being really, really corrupt in both taking the tithe from working class Christians and, selling basically pardons to go to heaven, which is where the Protestant Reformation started. And European kings also ruled by divine right. So they claimed that they were legitimate rulers because God appointed them to rule. So this strange blend of church and state in Europe for many centuries, where despots used God to legitimize their rule in a way that was obviously fraudulent. Eventually, the people got really sick of it. So during the Renaissance and post-Renaissance, Enlightenment era thinkers decided the best way to go about this would be to separate church and state altogether. This all led to the two kingdoms theory. Church should not exercise worldly government, and princes should not rule the church or have anything to do with the salvation of souls.
And I think you make a great point, Talha. It's just that influence coming onto the Muslim world greatly and radically affected how we now perceive education to this day. And when it comes to a colonized mindset, we have to take a step back and look at Islamic education and the education that was occurring in the Muslim world as well. You have great thinkers like Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, rahimahullah. You also have Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawzi, rahimahullah. And when it came to their education at their time of learning, it was, as we mentioned before, a blend of the secular educations, the sciences, philosophy, sociology, and theology, alongside with deep-rooted Islamic education, to the point where you could go to individuals with a variety of professions, whether it be a doctor at that time, whether it be an engineer at that time, whether it be an imam at that time, and you could derive some knowledge from them in regards to Islamiyah. Now, the colonized mindset of having the separation of church and state has led to Muslims in today's society having either a very big lack in religious education or a great lack in secular education. Apparently, there's no way to blend the two anymore, especially living in Western society where a kid goes to school, whether it be pre-K or kindergarten, at the age of 3, 4, or 5. So I think it's really difficult for parents to try and find that line. Where do we, send our kids to like hip school? Do they miss out on education? I think a lot of parents are struggling with that here in America in 2019.
So I think the colonizers also used, their establishment of their educational institutions to further their own societies. So they took the smartest people from the places that they colonized, and they started importing them into their own educational institutions, furthering their own societies and benefiting off of our labor and hard work, instead of the other way around, where Muslims would go and benefit their society from the society where they came from.
So from British colonies, smart Egyptians, smart Palestinians, smart Indians, smart Malays, they went to they were taken to the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, and smart Algerians and Moroccans, the French took them and educated them in the University of Paris. But this was all secular education with no regard at all to religious education. And when we had our own indigenous institutes, such as during the Abbasid Caliphate, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the same educational system over there produced, as you mentioned, Ali, it produced Al-Ghazali, who was a philosopher and a theologian and a jurist, as well as, somebody like Al-Kindi, who was a mathematician, a physician, and a musician. So the fact that the same educational system could produce people of all sorts of interests and specializations was a testament to the true blending of religious and secular education in indigenous Islamic systems, where that didn't continue in European educational systems.
So, Ali, how do you think that the colonization or this colonized mentality has affected our understanding or the method we use to understand Islamic sciences?
I think that's a great question, Ibrahim. It's just here in 2019, living in America, we see a lot of individuals, the level of importance they give to Islamic education has decreased, whether it be through the desire. As we mentioned before, we saw, Ibrahim, you mentioned before that there was a split in regards to this secular education and also religious studies. And I believe it was episode 1 where I mentioned Maulana Maududi and his views on seeing the separation between secular education and also religious education. And one of the points we have to take away from this is that the British elevated secular education to a point where they felt as though it was almost at a higher status than religious education. And that has trickled down into our mindsets today, where Mama and Baba want people to become doctors, lawyers, engineers, or a failure, essentially. And I think that's a major issue within our society today, and it needs to be addressed. And I feel as though our generation has the keys to do that by being able to reevaluate religious studies and bring them back to the forefront.
Hey man, hold up for a second. So you're telling me that when they're messing with our educational wellness, so you're saying that affected our religious and spirituality also?
Yeah, man. I think because our way of life beforehand didn't necessarily differentiate between religious and non-religious education. As soon as they started playing with our educational systems, our spiritual well-being took a major hit as well.
Yeah, Ali, that's a great point that you made. So I think we should talk about spiritual wellness and how the colonized mentality has affected that in the Muslim community.
So to start off, let's talk about the language of the colonizers. Arabic was replaced with English or French, depending on the country, in school and as a form of higher education and a prestige language. The impact that this had was it really devastated the preservation of Islamic sciences. So obviously Islamic sciences are preserved in the liturgical language of Islam, Arabic. And due to the nature of the sciences, whether it's the hadith or the Quranic sciences, Islamic jurisprudence, they're all preserved in Arabic. And the memorization is really highly valued, no matter the science, which takes an in-depth knowledge of Arabic to be able to do correctly.
I think, Talha, you make a great point, man. When it comes down to it, here, especially here in the Western world, we see either individuals primarily learning the language of English first, and then, or perhaps even if you're from the subcontinent like myself and ourselves, you learn Urdu or Hindi first. And one of the issues with that is that even though many people are born Muslims or they revert to Islam, you don't study the language of the Quran. So that takes a big hit when it comes to an individual's spirituality. Also, I think back to the colonizers' mindset, people value secular education to the point where, and I think you guys might agree with this or not, where you value secular education to such a high standard that you're willing to go out and learn the English language to study, books in English. But you can't do the same for your religion, which is in my opinion, to a certain degree, a little hypocritical. But I mean, who am I to say, because I haven't fully studied the Arabic language.
Maybe not hypocritical, but it's like it's just a side effect of our colonized mentality.
Yeah, the colonized mentality really, really lives on in this specific linguistic aspect. A lot of families, especially when they move to the West, you'll find like first generation, second generation descendants of immigrants in this country, their parents never speak to them in their native language or teach them Arabic. Like from the very beginning, they'll speak to them in English at home. And what they say is that we want them to, be able to do well in studies, so we want English to be their first language. But this really detracts from their connection to the culture, where they can't understand our native poetry and they can't understand our native literature, and so they feel really disconnected. And this still happens to this day. And unfortunately, I know of some cases as well, not just from immigrants to Western nations, but people in the old country. Like I was reading about some Hong Kongers who don't actually speak Cantonese or even Mandarin at all, despite being native Chinese. They're taught only English from birth.
I think that also comes back down to English being the language of business and trade as well. I mean, why is that there in the first place? Why is English valued at such a high level when the English language in itself is by any means not as detailed, in my personal opinion, not as detailed and not as pristine as the Arabic language. Mm-hmm. There's so many nuances to the Arabic language, and each letter has an associated meaning to it. We just never take the time to fully study it. Also, you see, more specifically in regards to the subcontinent, a lot of individuals want to teach their children. I know you mentioned a lot of first generations want to teach their children English so their children can succeed in secular education. But also they're very focused, I think now, from what I've seen personally, the older generations, the first immigrants, want to preserve Urdu in their grandchildren or their children as well, because they now realize that, hey, we're losing that language.
Too little, too late, man.
Yeah, but the Arabic language has never crossed anyone's mind.
So I think that's actually a side effect of the colonial mentality, because that's also a result of our nationalism that we have, that we think that Urdu is very important. Why is that the fact? So why isn't Arabic more important than Urdu? Because Arabic is the language of the Quran, and we should be learning that first, and not per se Urdu, right?
I don't know if I agree with you fully on your point about Urdu specifically, because the thing is, like, even a lot of second generation immigrants here, and like the university that I go to has a pretty high population of South Asians, but the amount
very high amount.
The amount that you see, the amount of South Asians, especially from the second and third generations, that you see actually using the language with each other is incredibly low. Mm-hmm. All three of us here are from the subcontinent, but we never speak to each other in Urdu. And there's a reason for that. It's because of that colonized mentality where either our parents or grandparents, somewhere in the line, English was valued more highly than Urdu.
Are you saying I'm a victim of the colonized mentality? Oh,
that's a hot take there, Ibrahim.
Oh, man.
I can go ahead and try and attempt to clarify that. When it comes down to it, as Talha, you mentioned, yes, I think somewhere along the lines, someone put an emphasis on the English language, and that led to a greater desire to study it and put your kids in private schools in the subcontinent where they could learn the British version of English and therefore achieve some sort of higher socioeconomic status.
English, right?
Yeah, essentially.
It's also like the phenomena of like international schools, right? Where you go to like a foreign country, like let's say, for example, Saudi Arabia, right? And then instead of learning studies in Arabic or like the native language of that country, you learn your studies in English or whatever that school's nationality is.
I can attest to that myself. I spent many years in the Middle East, and I did learn the indigenous language after moving there, but I might have been the only expatriate living, or at least within my friend circle, who got a good command of the native language besides just the greetings and the curse words, But this disconnect from Arabic or even Persian in the Islamic world after being colonized by the English and the French, it really, really cut us off from our academia in a way that's very hard to describe. Here's an analogy that I don't know if it's entirely relevant or not, but imagine English speakers being forced to speak another language and thus being cut off from all the industrial and technological progress since the Industrial Revolution. How would that set us back? We won't be able to progress from there. We'd have to relearn everything in another language. And that's pretty analogous, I think, to what happened when the colonizers came through and forced their language on us. We got cut off from literally 12 centuries of academia in another language.
Yeah, I think that's a great point you make, Talha. It's just there's a bigger issue to be seen. It's not just the language itself, but moreover, it happens to be the actual academia that is being stripped away from the minds of people. And it goes really, really deep into the roots of society, especially among second and third generation individuals. Because now, when it comes to spiritual wellness, the original topic of educational wellness, where we saw the split, is now also affecting, as you mentioned before, Ibrahim, is now also affecting the spiritual wellness of individuals living here in America.
Let's switch gears for a second. So in terms of spiritual wellness, we're talking right now about the linguistic impact. That's not the only impact that happened through colonization, of course. The British were famous for the divide and conquer strategies, and no doubt they used race, of course, they used ethnicity, but they also used religion in a major way. And not just inter-religion, but also intra-religious division. A big example of this is during the British rule in India, they sponsored the creation kind of the Ahmadi sect of Islam, which by unanimous agreement is a deviant sect that is not really Islamic at all.
Yeah.
And it was sponsored by the British in order to start creating division, right? Another thing that they did was that they increased prestige for Ismaili Muslims. They're a real minority of Muslims, right? Not trying to comment on their legitimacy, but it is true that they were very they were a very small number. But the British brought the first Aga Khan from Persia to India, employed him in the British army, and allowed him to propagate his message. Again, I'm not commenting on the legitimacy of that sect, but the fact of the matter is that what happens then is that more people are divided from the mainstream and feel that they have a secondary allegiance that causes this kind of division.
So I think we touched upon that subject a little bit last week when we talked about culture and how in sports they use the same sort of strategy to divide and conquer. And I think one of the main issues with colonization is that it really divided us and it made us really weak, even though our number is huge. We keep saying the same number, like 1.6 or 1.8 billion Muslims. But really, on the global stage, what an impact do we have? And I think the reason why we don't have that impact anymore is because of the colonized mentality, or like it's the effect of colonization, basically.
Yeah, I thoroughly agree with both the points you guys made. When it comes down to it, fractioning a large group leads to dissent, and that dissent leads to essentially nothing getting done.
So let's talk about the fracturing of another large group, our communities.
We all know that when it comes to raising our children specifically, it takes a whole village, right? The saying is it takes a village to raise a child. And a lot of people don't necessarily wish to have that perspective anymore, especially from the colonized mindset where we tend to have like a nuclear family, right? Where it's just yourself, your parents, and your immediate family. And we don't necessarily look to our extended family for assistance anymore. In fact, from the subcontinent where we're from, we see a lot of emphasis placed on respecting, your maternal uncles and aunts, and also your paternal uncles and aunts, and also like your grandparents as well. But I've noticed, and this is a really big trend, especially around the topic of woman empowerment amongst little girls and women growing up here in America with their families, is that when it comes to the time for marriage, especially, they tend to desire a husband that doesn't necessarily want to take care of his parents, actually. So they tend to, in that sense, they want to live separate with just herself and her husband. But she doesn't recognize, the resource that having, that grandparents to take care of future grandchildren and whatnot is.
I think it's a valid point, but I think it's also important to mention that it's a perfectly reasonable reasonable
request
or a reasonable stipulation to have in your marriage contract. I mean, that's like 100% up to like the woman, right? And I think that's the right that they should have.
All right, so here we're going to dive into the fiqh of marriage. Bismillah. I'm messing with you. So you wanted to say something, man?
So really, this is the deepest level of penetration of the colonizer. And the fact that they broke apart the family structure that we had just attests to the very, very in-depth kind of penetration of our lifestyle and our wellness. To speak kind of specifically about subcontinental culture, but this is true of other Eastern Oriental cultures as well. Large families would live together, and that would nurture a kind of family-oriented mindset within the youth, where family was very important. This was deliberately broken apart by our colonizers. If a family unit stayed together, they would be really hard to divide. But if you could cause division within a family and cause siblings to break off from each other, cause parents to be separated from their children, this really would increase their penetration of our lifestyle. This is not just a phenomenon in our Eastern cultures. I'd say the best example we have of this is specifically Native Americans. After the U.S. and Canada finally stopped genociding indigenous people in this continent, they switched to making Indian residential schools instead. And the point of this school was that actually the founder, his famous quote is, "Kill the Indian, save the man." They just wanted to rip these children apart from their families and indoctrinate them with ideals that the white man thought was superior.
And I think, Talha, you make a really good point. Another example or another sort of society in which you see this occurring is African Americans here in America as well. You see one of the greatest examples that I could probably name off the top of my head would be the war on drugs, and how we see a specific targeting of racial minorities and the fracturing of families within the United States of America. And that is also just another example of how the Western colonizers are attempting to break apart a specific family unit in order to create tensions and divisions within a community. Now, back to the colonized mindset of the subcontinent in North Africa, you see also the effect of industries like Bollywood and Hollywood on the family wellness and the family unit. Ibrahim, do you have any thoughts on that as well? Because I know the influence of Bollywood and Hollywood is huge, as we mentioned in the last episode. But how specifically does it affect the family?
Yeah, we kind of touched upon that in the last episode. So we talked about how Bollywood and Hollywood have been influenced by the colonized mentality, and how they have such a great influence on our culture. And one facet of our culture is the family unit, and how different family members function with each other. And I think that the Hollywood and Bollywood has a certain perception or a certain portrayal of certain family archetypes or certain family relations, where one family member is always feuding with the other family member. And and people religiously follow these TV shows and these movies, and like we said, Hollywood and Bollywood combined make 6.9, or what was the number exactly?
It was I think 6.2 billion.
Yeah, 6.2
and that was
billion.
in 2001.
Mm-hmm. So imagine how much money they make and how much influence they have now, because the populations obviously exponentially grow. So just how much more reach that they have right now. So maybe Talha, you can add upon that a little bit.
Like I said, if you can break apart the family unit, then really you've penetrated the mind of the colonized. And the oppression has reached its peak over there. And this is exactly what they try to do. A lot of times you see in indigenous peoples, a large family is considered a good thing, because to get pretty specific here, it takes a burden off the parents if the uncles can step in, the aunts can step in, the grandparents can be there. It also passes on this cultural legacy, right? So if you're living in one of our kind of traditional family structures and you get to see your grandparents every day, you're learning from them things that your parents wouldn't necessarily have time to pass on to you. Like for a lot of people who did have the good fortune of growing up with their grandparents, it's often their grandma who'd read them stories that she heard from her grandma, and it keeps that oral legacy and oral tradition alive, and inspires a sense of culture and belonging within the people. So if you can take this out, then really there's nothing left to stop these people from completely submitting to the idea that the colonized has a superior culture.
And Talha, that's a great point you just made right there. I wanna focus a little bit more on Ibrahim's topic, specifically in regards to the influence of Hollywood and Bollywood. One specific relationship we see that is constantly in turmoil, quote unquote, within Hollywood and Bollywood films is the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law. We see there's always a constant struggle between the love, both sides seeking the love of the son, or in this case, the husband as well. And this, for some reason, has very, very deeply entrenched itself within the cultural and societal outlook on how we view this relationship. For whatever reason, it's very detrimental, especially in the subcontinent. We see that this in itself has also led to a desire for women to not want to live with their mother-in-law or their father-in-law. And Taha, you have a point on that?
Totally right, man. This is not to say that tensions between in-laws have never existed, right? I think tensions between in-laws have always existed and will always exist. But the point of these kind of films is to always portray one as a protagonist and one as an antagonist, and that there is never room for compromise over there. They can never work together and live together and learn to get through their differences. That's a very rare theme. More often it's just, somebody's in the right, somebody's in the wrong, and eventually somebody wins and somebody loses, which is not how we should be approaching familial tensions at all. So what is the way to approach familial tensions? If we can fix our families, then perhaps our wellness will get back together, and so will our culture.
So Talha, I think you're about to approach a topic that we want to actually ask our interviewee, brother Isa Ibn Mata, and he will be on the show this upcoming week to discuss the topic of culture and also the perspective of the colonized mind and how the colonizers affected our mentality in regards to all aspects of life.
And also how we can recover and, better ourselves and improve from where we are so basically right now stuck in the colonized mentality.
Yeah, so once again, I want to thank you all for tuning in to the Fourth Podcast. Again, be sure to give us a follow on Instagram at thefourth.productions and Twitter at thefourth_prod, P-R-O-D. And be sure to tune in again next week when we will bring on an interviewee to discuss the problem of the colonial mind and how to find solutions to the issues we discussed. As of now, we hope you have a great rest of the week. Oh, yes. Masjid politics.